Well, now joining us in studio is Dr. Chandler James, assistant professor at the University of Oregon in political science. First of all, as always, how are you this morning?
I'm doing well. Good morning, Zach.
Good, good. Yeah, we got a lot to talk about. Let's get into it. Now, we'll get back to the federal funding pause, that potential pause, which is on pause at the moment. We'll talk about that in a moment. But first, we've been hearing a lot nationally about executive orders in the first week plus of the Trump administration. Let's start with just a basic definition so people at home can understand better exactly what those mean and how far-reaching they are. So what is exactly an executive order?
So the President of the United States is the sole head of the executive branch, which is one of the branches of the federal government. And they, as the sole leader of the branch, have a wide discretion to delineate rules and administrative structures to direct agencies and people who are working in the federal employ to behave according to a certain set of practices. So presidents can use executive orders as a form of unilateral policy making to shape policy without congressional decree. Mm-hmm. Now, Congress can push back against unilateral actions with a law which supersedes executive orders. Congress can also strike down executive orders. So,
When he could, in the current administration, they have control of all three branches of government. Does that make it less likely that Congress will push back against executive orders administered by an administration that is in the same political alignment?
So this is a part of the politics of unilateral action. Presidents can seize initiative by introducing a policy change through executive order, and then Congress, if they choose not to respond, mm-hmm. whether it be because they agree with the policy or there's not enough interest in Congress sure. to respond, then the executive order basically is tantamount to law. And so with respect to this particular executive order that Trump just pushed forward, if enough Republicans, if all the Republicans mm-hmm. agree with it, then it means that the courts will be the venue for the action to be
stopped. As we've seen already with a federal judge issuing a pause on that federal funding pause. Now, are there famous executive orders in the past that might ring a bell to folks that help clear up exactly what they are?
Yeah, so some of the most famous actions that the federal government has taken are actually executive orders. For example, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. The Japanese internment under FDR was an executive order that was unconstitutional, but only found to be so later. Nixon created the EPA with an executive order.
No kidding.
Kennedy started the Peace Corps with an executive order and then moved around discretionary funds. And then later that was kind of solidified into law. And then Democratic presidents here recently have and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, have covered millions of acres of federal land mm-hmm. Through executive orders to protect them from development.
Fabulous. Okay, so let's get back to this potential federal funding pause. It was administered by the Trump administration yesterday. It was paused by a federal judge before the day was through. Have we seen something like this on this scale before?
Pausing an executive order? So this scale or this particular action, freezing the disbursement of laws that have been funded and appropriated by Congress. This has been done before. It's called impoundment in some respects.
Okay.
However, not at this scale. This is a total sea change in the way that presidents have traditionally approached the budget. Their job, effectively, by Constitution, is to execute the law. Congress writes the laws and they're in charge of the purse, so they spend the money. They raise the taxes, and the president is supposed to execute the law, whether or not they necessarily agree with the law. However, presidents do have some discretion, and some have suggested that the president, if he's so concerned about cutting down the budget, he should negotiate with Congress in the upcoming budget arena. Yeah. However, Trump has used executive action to seize initiative on this issue, in many respects, forcing Congress and the courts to respond and changing the discourse on the way that federal money is spent.
Now, you talked about it a little bit, that the Congress is one place that you can see pushback, but the court system is the other place. And a federal judge did issue a pause on this. Legal challenges are probably sure to follow beyond just the first pause. Do you think that this is something that survives legal challenges and we see this federal pause instituted come next week?
Well, I think the Constitution is pretty clear on budgetary authority and spending authority. Mm-hmm. So I would suspect that if this particular executive order reaches to the Supreme Court, that it would probably be struck down. But with a 6-3 conservative majority that is, in many respects, holds a lot of antipathy toward the federal government, we don't know for sure.
3 of those judges appointed by the current president as well. Do we think that we spoke with some local agencies over the past 24 hours about this potential pause, and a lot of them said, we don't know what's going to come. Is that kind of the way, even politically speaking, we're kind of in a wait and see moment to see how this will work out, how it'll play out?
Well, I think that that's something to appreciate about politics in this era, in particular, in general. We have theories, we have regularities, we have some understanding of what's happened in the past and what we might expect, but ultimately we don't know for sure. And so I think it's always important to be careful and cautious about predictions because so much of the future is unwritten.
Absolutely. One last thing I wanted to touch on before we let you go. Got about a minute left, so quickly. We are talking a lot about immigration as well, and Oregon has the designation as a sanctuary state. What does that designation mean, and what kind of protections does that provide for folks living in the state?
So I think that for each state, becoming a sanctuary city means maybe different things. However, what that broadly means is that people who are undocumented can send their kids to school without fear that they will be picked up by immigration officials, or that they can, have their kids in hospitals without fear that they're going to be deported. That, essentially their legal status won't too much affect how they operate within that particular jurisdiction.
So it's kind of the ability to operate here in the community on a day-to-day basis without much interruption. So,
right.
Fabulous. And Dr. James, as always, great to get your insight on these things as they continue to move forward. We'll probably have a whole bunch of fresh topics to talk about next week, Wednesday, when we have you back. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, and nice seeing you again.
Yeah, absolutely.